Making news in recent years have been similar high-grossing sales of works by artists that include Brazil's Tarsila do Amaral, Uruguay's Joaquin Torres-Garcia, and Cuba's Wilfredo Lam. In 2008, a 1945 painting by another Mexican artist, Rufino Tamayo's Trovador, sold at Christie's for $7.2 million, further accelerating the value of modern Latin American art on an international market. When we wrote that, in 2011, despite the uncertainty of a widening global economic recession, the art market's appetite for Latin American art had not waned. We wanted to begin, then, with one of several historic ironies that define the belated nature of the modern project. It takes a 21st century marketplace to establish the symbolic value of Latin American vanguard art produced from 1920 to 1960. Our discursive point was to say that the appeal of Latin America for the United States and Europe in cultural terms cannot be isolated from other social and historical factors. It allowed us to frame modernism's relation of the present to the past as being a narrative inseparable from the process of politics, economics, and culture. In Latin America, this pressure between past and present differs from the rhetorical rejection of the past that European modernists often proclaimed. Latin American modernists recognized their uncertain status within the West, simultaneously insiders and outsiders as a consequence of being settlers within colonized lands. This sense of belonging and difference from the West often manifested itself in a contradictory relationship with the United States as the regional exemplar of modernity without an ethical project. Latin American modernists derived multiple strategies for negotiating the relationship with dominant forms of modernism. What, they asked, are the cultural methods for fashioning a sense of local belonging, in line also with modernity at large? In the history of a dubious term for a location, Latin America, local artists and intellectuals viewed their position not as a part of a vague and overarching region, but as a problem that has allowed them to ask important questions about nationhood, identity, and modern life. Today, as scholars situated in institutions from differing shores, we provide counterpoint to assertions in what others say about Latin America, with differences spoken from various sites within Latin America. The conversation over the next 2 days promises to look closely at the institutional and cultural links in the problem that links Latin America and Spain in the present of an academic discipline and museum institutional framings that look to questions of cultural expediency, to the continued influx of Latin American migration to Spain, the increased markets open between Spain and Latin America, contemporary art and research, book publishing, and the mass media industry, and the social processes that these cultural contingencies entail. It is in this context that the symposium aims to, and now I quote from its proposal, to analyze the various ways in which ideas and perceptions about Spanish and Latin American art have evolved in the last decades, dramatically increasing their international visibility and relevance, to address the implications of shaping a new canon for such problematic categories as Spanish and Latin American art in the context of general art history, end quote. I turn the podium over now to co-organizers for the Dallas Symposium, Eugenio Carmona, Distinguished Professor of Art, Universidad de Málaga, and head of the research project Narraciones de lo Moderno, and María Dolores Jiménez-Blanco, Professor of Art History, Universidad Complutense, Madrid. Please join me in giving them a very warm welcome.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you, Roberto, for your presentation, your very nice presentation. My name is María Dolores Jiménez-Blanco, and today I speak not only in my own name, but also on behalf of the head of the research project, Narraciones de lo Moderno, Eugenio Carmona, Distinguished Professor from Málaga University, and on behalf of Diana Bechler, Director of the Institute for Research in Art and Culture at the Universidad 3 de Febrero in Buenos Aires. When I say that it is an honor for us to be here today at the opening of this symposium, Tales from Another Shore, Narraciones and Narratives and Perspectives on Latin American Art at the Krum Auditorium in Dallas, in SMU Dallas. This symposium, bridging, as Roberto said, museum and universities from Spain and the Americas, is the third meeting organized by our research project. And we are deeply grateful to SMU and to the Meadows Museum, and particularly to its director, Marc Roglan, who immediately and very warmly responded to our symposium proposal, and who has enthusiastically and actively supported this initiative since we first talked about it some years ago, making this international meeting possible and including it in the Meadows Museum public programs. We're also indebted to Carmen Smith, Director of Education in the museum, for her thoughtfulness and perfect work through the whole process. Because this institution is a museum, Meadows Museum is a museum in an university campus, and because it is a reference for every academic study or museum approach to Spanish art in the United States, and now growing into a center for Latin American culture, as Marc Roglan will explain later on, this is beyond any doubt the best place to hold a symposium aiming to explore how narratives on art history and criticism have affected and increased the visibility of Spanish art from old masters to modern contemporary art, and of Latin American art in the last decades. It is the best possible place, especially for two reasons. First, because both academia and museums have been involved in this process. And second, because we would like to explore the decisive role played in this evolution by American museums, American museum directors and curators, American art critics, American artists, American professors, collectors, as we will see. In these 2 days, we will address general issues as well as specific topics, all related to a central question: how art history, art criticism, and museum work, being it collecting or curating, is ultimately a form of narrative, and how the way we perceive and understand it is conditioned by the way art is told or presented to us by all these agents, intimately linked to different interests and circumstances. We would like to apply this general concept of narratives to a particular case study, the perception of Spanish and Latin American art, or to be more precise, the various ways in which ideas and perceptions of Latin American art and Spanish art have evolved in the last decades, sometimes dramatically, as we said, increasingly their international visibility and relevance. In the past 3 years, Professors Carmona, Wechsler, and myself have been exploring this research field in several meetings, occasionally linked to exhibitions and publications in Madrid and Buenos Aires. And today we are thrilled and challenged also by this opportunity to share our thoughts and interests with very distinguished colleagues and friends from Spain and the Americas, to whom we are looking forward to listen. As you may see in the program, the symposium is organized in 3 sessions. In the first session, we will be talking about museums and collections, and we are thankful today to have 3 relevant speakers who will make different approaches to this topic, as they will share with our audience their own museum experience, as well as their project and ideas about this matter. Manuel Borja Villel, Director of the Museo Reina Sofia de Madrid, Marc Roglan, Linda P. and William A. Custer, Director of the Meadows Museum in Dallas, and Ángel Kallenberg, former Director of the Museo Nacional de Artes Visuales de Montevideo. The second session will deal with modern art history, or more precisely, on how, why, and who, and when the tale of art history has been crafted. In this session, the 3 members of the research Narraciones of the research project, Narraciones de lo Moderno, Professor Carmona, Professor Wechsler, and myself, will focus on specific aspects related with our own previous fields of research and publications. Cubism and beyond, in the case of Professor Carmona, realisms in plural, in the case of Professor Wechsler, and the American perception of Spanish art, in my case. The third session, to be held tomorrow, will be devoted to the evolution of somehow the slippery, problematic category of Latin American art, both from the side of museum and academia. And to discuss this fascinating topic, we are thrilled to have María Carmen Ramírez, Wortham Curator of Latin American Art from the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and Director of the International Center for the Arts of the Americas, and Miriam Basilio from NYU, Assistant Professor of Art History and Museum Studies in New York University. Last but not least, we have a very special treat at the end of the day tomorrow, since we will be listening to a very, very dear friend and colleague, Dori Ashton, who once wrote a book entitled A Fable of Modern Art, and who has been one of the keenest, the most receptive, and also more knowledgeable experts in modern Spanish and Latin American art among art critics in America, and who is also a constant presence, not only in the art scene, but also in the Spanish scene. She comes very often to Madrid to give lectures, and we really appreciate having her there. Dori will share with us her own ideas and personal recollections about Spanish art. In a few moments, we will start the symposium, but before doing so, I would like to quote some fragments of the text that Professor Carmona has written as a point of departure for this symposium, and which is available to all of you in the handout. I quote, "Perhaps at this moment in time, the terms narratives in relation to art history and criticism is becoming widely used. Perhaps it has become fashionable. However, succumbing simply to a fashionable topic is definitely not part of our project. We realize that by using the concept of narratives, art history itself has created the conscience of the self-awareness of its abilities to systemize and transmit. If these abilities are to go beyond being more than a mere archive index or primary heritage carrier, however valuable, they must be expressed through media close or parallel to narrative structures." A.B. Warburg or Ernst Gombrich perceived this fundamental aspect of our history in a most revealing manner, now included in the theoretical thinking of Hans Belting, Georges Didier Huberman, while Anne D'Aleva or Juan Antonio Ramirez even consider art history a literary genre in the strictest sense of the word. But while aware of this, from our position of proximity to certain artists and works of art, to certain collections and cultural experiences, we have no wish to consider complex or self-satisfied theoretical frameworks. Despite our depth to these frameworks, we are undertaking more simple and pragmatic exercises of analysis and comprehension, clearly proceeding from critical exercise, art history, museology, and curatorial work. On the other hand, but directly related to the foregoing, throughout our research work, we have been considering the enormous, decisive importance of art criticism and American museology in the creation of narratives, points of view, and epistemological or historiographical vectors on modern Spanish and Latin American art. And this critical and museographical performance, while free from the canons of evaluation expounded in European critical context, has brought about the need to translate for North American comprehension specific cultural contexts devised and expounded in Spain and Latin America. These translations have become incorporated in the academic and critical circles in Spain and Latin America as their own factors of evaluation. Today, we are aware that the way this critical heritage has traveled and mutated, creating different scales of values and different topics that guide the reading and commentary of numerous important works of art and creative experience. An analysis of the narrative keys of these transmissions appeared to be necessary, almost urgent, and cannot be postponed. End of quote. So let's not postpone any longer the opening of this symposium, and thank you for your attention. We will start now with the first session, Shaping Narratives of Spanish and Latin American Art, Museums and Collections, The aim of this session is to compare and contrast three different approaches to the museum as a showcase, or rather as a loudspeaker that makes possible for chosen art tendencies and artists to gain presence and prestige in the cultural world. The way museums choose to construct the presentation of their permanent collection makes apparent certain reckoning of art history. It is not only a matter of how aesthetic canons are agreed by academics and museum curators, as they also refer to so many other layers of culture and life, including ideologies, power, identity, market, global political balance, social structures. To deal with this fascinating topic, we have the honor to present Manuel Borja Villel, director of the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, who has just renovated in his office. And ever since he undertook the responsibility of the direction of the museum at 2008, the museum has experienced very deep changes in its permanent collection, also in the exhibitions and in public programs. These changes have opened to areas, not only geographical areas, but also conceptual areas that were not contemplated before in the museum, thus giving a complete new life to the institution. Also, and very important, the museum has undergone important organizative modifications that will completely change the museum life in the future, increasing the participation of agents different than the state, which, because it is a public museum, was the only owner of the institution hitherto. So let's pass to Manolo Borja for his presentation.
Okay, thank you. And actually, as some of you know, I'm from Valencia in Spain. And actually, in spite of my accent, I spent 10 years in the States, and even I wrote a book and everything. What I meant is that actually when I was here, they keep asking me where I was from, so I didn't know what to say about Valencia, because as you know, we speak Catalan, but it's not like the Catalan in the north. So I used to say being from Valencia is like being from Texas. So somehow I got the fantasy that when I come to Texas, my accent will be really understood. I will mingle with the people. My surprise was when I arrived yesterday that actually they understood me even less than in New York. So, so you'll have to bear with me my accent, but as most of you speak Spanish, I suppose it will be no problem. So my presentation, it will have three parts. First, three epilogues, three introductions that I'll try to make short. Then it will be the presentation of the collection, and then an epilogue about what it implies, what kind of changes, structural changes and political changes imply this, what we are doing in terms of narrative of collection. So the first introduction, obviously this is Lars von Trier, one of his last movies, not one that I like especially, but it works perfectly for what I wanted to say, is Melancholia. And as you know, it tells the story of a planet, among other things, much more complex, tells the story of a planet that is collapsing against the Earth. And at the end, the last sequence, you have two women and a child that are holding hands, and somehow they are waiting for the planet to collapse. Somehow the hut becomes a metaphor of the house, the structure, and the situation of the protagonist is one of totally giving up to the end of a world, not to an alternative view of the world. And somehow this movie, or this image, for me, reflects the situation of Spanish art today, in the sense that after 2 decades of booming of museums, of booming of the economy, somehow the country has entered in a deep melancholia, which at the end is kind of regressive, a melancholia which is non-operative, a melancholia which means just letting things happen. A melancholia that has also being used by those, the enemies of culture and progress that in countries like ours, there are many still, to, as we say in Spanish, to throw the children with the dirty water, to show the child, with, the baby with the dirty water, in the sense that, in a way, culture itself is being questioned as somehow a luxury. And that also links to another situation, is one where probably we can say that there is some kind of aesthetics of recession in Spain now, and maybe also in other countries, an aesthetics of adaptation, an aesthetics of survival, an aesthetics that somehow is an aesthetics of adapting to what it is there. It's just the opposite of what a work of art is supposed to do. It's the opposite of what a work of art is supposed to promote, which is change, questioning of ideas. And that, of course, has to do with our topic, with the local and global. I mean, one of the many disasters we had in Spain lately was that there was no Spanish artists selected for the Venice Biennial, after, of course, with the exception of the official Spanish pavilion. After a while, the curator, apparently, Massimiliano Johnny, apparently thought it over, and I think now there is one Spanish artist. But the question is, again, one question that has been recurrent in Spain during the last 50 years is why they don't like us, why we are nowhere, what's wrong with us, what's wrong with them, actually, why they don't understand what we are doing. And it's not that the Spanish art has not been promoted. In the last 2 decades, through governmental institutions, the promotion of Spanish art has been quite big in terms of exhibitions, in terms of exchanges. It's not that they are not good professionals. It's not, I want to believe, that they are not good artists. And ironically, now in the last 2 decades that art and culture has been promoted, actually the presence of Spanish art outside has been much less than during Franco periods. I mean, if you remember the generation of Tapies, Saura, Millares, all of them, they were all over, at least in Europe, or Tapies, when he was barely 30, he had already a one-man show at the Guggenheim. So somehow, as implies, give us to say this thing that contra Franco vivíamos mejor, against Franco we live better. But what's wrong? What's wrong in the relationship between our local history and the system of the world, the art system of the world? Probably is the question itself. Actually, during these decades, we've been obsessed either with doing local, even monographic, of the most absurd artists' museums, or become totally international. International meaning basically giving up to market, to fashion. And the problem is, as I said, is the question. It looks like for us it would be more important to be acknowledged than, it was more important than acknowledgement than the knowledge. It was more important to be recognized than to question the other tendencies, the established tendencies. And that gives us not to understand that maybe history should not be written as a teleological, essentialistic, non-inclusive, a history that doesn't allow for contamination, doesn't allow for misgiving, doesn't allow for shifts, but however, history should be understood in this other way. And maybe in this other way, Spanish art or Latin American art maybe will have some sense. We have to understand that there is not only a macro history, a history of big names, a history of the long term, but also we have micro stories. We have micro history, micro stories. We have to understand that the gaps of history do not need to be filled out by some kind of big master. We need to understand that the gaps of history, they are part of the history being told. We have to understand that probably it's necessary in our case to write history in a different way, to relate to create narratives in a different way, in a way that is in relation, in a way that is in relation between two opposites, between the way we look at the world and the way the world look at us. A history that is also in tension between the long and the short history. A history that realizes that there is not only one time, but many times. And therefore, if you see the work of Gego or Palazuelo, for example, you cannot think of them as just late formalists, just because they maybe didn't understand conceptual art or minimal art. They are just different. The way time develops in certain areas is just different. We have to understand, following Edouard Glissant, that in this history, that the idea of history as dealing with singular objects, of singular subjects, that is, a history that is related to his own logic, has to yield, has to give up to a history that we call specific, a history that is specific to a place and to a time, a history that is also specific to the one that talks and to the one that listens, a history that is in between, a history that is, again, full of breaks and shifts. Somehow, like the storyteller of Benjamin, a history that is performative. Of course, in this sense, we are losing the security of the big narrative. We are losing the security of the discipline. And we are entering into a different type of area which is more approximative, that arrives to the subjects from different point of views, and all those point of views keep on antagonizing between each other. That means also this other way of storytelling, historytelling, this other way, this other type of narrative, it implies that we are questioning our notion of identity, our notion of belonging. Maybe that was also another of the problems of Spanish art history. Maybe we were too focused on a 19th century idea of identity, and I'm Catalan, so don't take me wrong. I'm not against the identity of a country. So, but maybe this identity should not be linked any longer to a fixed place. Maybe this identity should be thought like a cosmology. It should be thought in dynamic terms. It should be thought in terms that have to do with cosmologies, with vectors, with force fields. And if we are like that, we probably realize that there is, again, an alternative form of narrating, an alternative form of curating. And that brings us to another idea, is Latin America, and the idea of modernism in Latin America and Spain. Of course, the discovering of America was a big change in terms of our Ptolemaic or the Ptolemaic perception of the world in relation to economics, to social. Of course, Enlightenment started both in Latin America, maybe less in Spain, and in Europe at the same time. But it's true that during the 18th, 19th century, the developments of modernism were different. And the developments of modernism in Latin America and Spain made that modernity was perhaps reduced to a small elite. And it also made that there was different levels of organization, different levels of understanding the world. And when the European model collapsed, like it has collapsed recently, maybe this kind of perverse, this kind of hybrid, this kind of monstrous, to use the term of Toni Negri, modernity, maybe, or Baroque modernity, maybe makes more sense. And this is what we somehow would like to bring in terms of the collection. So then I go to the second introduction. That, of course, is George Orwell and J.G. Ballard. Because if we are saying that we are entering into crisis, what kind of crisis? Crisis in relation to what? crisis in relation to what models? Basically, in terms of museums, we have two models that respond to two moments of 20th century. The first moment, it has to do with modernity. It has to do with the idea of autonomy, of knowledge, of autonomy of art, and the other, where somehow any kind of critical attitude, any kind of questioning, interjection is absorbed from the start. So that's why I like to put these two novels. One that, of course, refers to these moments of is 1984, but it refers to the moments of the fascisms in Europe, where only reading, only artistic or educational activity is considered dangerous. Because it's considered dangerous because it will reveal somehow this kind of big brother, this kind of authoritarian figure that is hiding things. However, 50 years later, things change. 50 years later, we realize through Ballard that there is no longer this kind of authority figure. Actually, in the case of Kingdom Come, a commercial mall outside of London, the authority figure is the spokesman of the commercial mall. And he has actually nothing to censor, nothing to repress, because the repression is self-infected. The repression is based in understanding everything as a commodity and understanding human relations as transactional relations, relations of exchanging of goods. So, again, there is no censorship because, as the protagonist says, there is nothing to censor. So, what to do in that situation? What to do between one past that we don't like and a present, or a past that in which we don't recognize, and a present in which that we don't like anymore? The question comes, as in other occasions, by somebody like Pasolini in a short movie that he did in the 60s called Che cosa sono le nuvole? What are the clouds? In this movie, he represents a drama, a theater, as you could see, a theater where you have Othello and Iago, and somehow they seem to be representing the drama of Shakespeare. But as soon as the movie is developing, we realize that there are some strange things. In the first case is that the protagonists, they are puppets. They are actually have strings and move in relation to some kind of marionneteer, some kind of person that is above them. And what Pasolini is telling us by that is that society is organized around texts, and that those texts have some kind of fatality in relation to our behavior, and somehow we are condemned to repeat them once and again. And those texts are the narratives, the structures that organize our lives. But then something else happens. In this case, is that Othello is not jealous. He doesn't feel like killing Desdemona. And actually, he's asking Iago why he has to kill her if he doesn't feel any problem with her. On the other hand, Desdemona likes to be killed once and again and doesn't understand why Othello is doubting all the time. So what is the solution? The solution that Pasolini gives us is somehow the solution that Brecht also gave us in the 30s when he was doing his theater, his theories about theater, is the questioning of the theater through the theater, is the questioning of the text through the text. So in this case, is the consequence of the doubt is the rebellion of the public. The public goes into the stage and somehow changes, transforms the structure of the theater, the structure of the narrative. So, if that's the three introductions, and what kind of models we have? Basically, a museum could be like a triangle where you have 3 points. One that is the narratives, the stories you tell. Second is the dispositives, and third is the public to whom you address. The stories of the modern museum, to understand each other, is this story that is evolutionary, psychological, is a story where there is no difference between thinking and speech, is the story that we know with the dominance of the hegemony of the vision, where everything that doesn't fit in that history, of course, is provincial or derivative. Of course, the structure that fits that program, it has to be the white cube, is the structure that is based on immediacy, is the structure that is based on transparency. And that is aimed to a generic public, a public that has a kind of experience, which is always an experience of the flaneur, of the walking, is an experience which is disembodied, is an experience which is based on an idea or vision. That model, through the questioning of the artists during the 60s, 70s, etc., was put into question, as we all know, and in the 80s it was changed by a different model, which is actually the hegemonical model today, where if the history before it was exclusive, it was a non-inclusive history, now it's just the opposite. But still there is no difference, because the difference is cancelled in this case. The difference is not rejected, it's cancelled by the container, everything matters. And the structure of mediation in this case is the branding. It's just to get names, to get elements to be acknowledged, to be sold. And the public to which is addressed is, of course, audiences, is not public, is not public any longer. In that structure, we have, of course, no place. So the idea is maybe to change it. The idea is to change it in a different structure, one that has a different form of storytelling, with a relationship between local and global, as we were saying, macro and micro, a structure of the collection that is oral, to be, in the sense of Edouard Glissant again, to be oral, it means to be performative, it means to be transversal, it means to break the separations of the discipline, and that implies also a new cartography, a different way of understanding history in the 20th century. That implies changing the structures of mediation, implies a different type of dispositive, and of course, that implies a different type of organization, where education is changed, where education is based on the idea of giving agency to the publics. That means the public will have to do their own, the narratives the museum provide, and that means, and which is more radical, changing certain ideas of the museum, changing the ideas of ownership, changing the idea of the collection, changing the idea of the property. Maybe instead of being owners of works, we should start thinking of ourselves as custodians of works, works that belong to everybody, works that we share, works that create a choral history, works where not only you give your own interpretation of the subjects, of the objects, but also works in which other people also give their own interpretation. That's what we call the archives of the commons. So let's go step by step. That's the introduction. The collection, according to this logic, is divided in 5 chapters. Originally, it was divided in 3. But according as the closest the date, the deadline of my contract comes, I keep adding new chapters. So there is always something to do. But actually, there are 5 chapters, 4 chapters and an epilogue. The first chapter, of course, is the 30s. We have Guernica, but also we have Civil War. The 30s is a moment which is very interesting. It's a moment where it's a moment that is always said that is a moment maybe too classical, too academical. It's a moment where there are no formal inventions, but it's a moment where artists are interested in something else. It's a moment where artists are interested in the reality where they live. They are interested in creating a space of resistance. They are interested in the interjection. They are interested in creating spaces of relationship. Also, it's a moment where art has a kind of a very special ambiguity. We know that fascisms were very close at one moment with power in Italy and even in Germany, but especially in Italy. We know of that ambiguity. We know that art could work in both directions, and artists, many artists, they are conscious of that, like Brecht, for example, who starts questioning the theater from within the theater. So for all those elements, which somehow also are linked to the situation today, is a period that for us is very important to study. In addition, we know that through D.D. Uberman, that the works have many lives. They have the life of their moment, but also they live like ghosts during many lives. And like ghosts, they have different roles in different moments. And those different lives are something that also the museum have to be ready to discuss. We know also that that period is a period of pedagogy, is a period of discussion of the public sphere, is a period where the role of the public is very important. So we start with Guernica, of course. We should not move it. So we contextualize it first, and of course, Guernica, as I said, had many lives. Had the life of the painting, and it has the life of the magnets, it has the life of the merchandising, which is a life turned into a commodity, but which at another moment, it was a life, a political element. So all those elements are reflected on the display, on the way the collection is displayed. First, by contextualizing Guernica, first by putting the history of Guernica, so we have the drawings of how Guernica was developed, how there is this already Baroque element, how is this element that relates to other things Picasso was doing. Then contextualize in the historical context, of course, the pavilion of the Republic with the sculpture of Alberto with Calder, that was exactly one word very much related with Guernica for reasons that you all know. The idea of the pavilion as being propaganda, the idea that the Guernica was a mural, the idea that Guernica was black and white, the idea that also Guernica had to do with the newsreels, with information, with the documentation of the time. So all that is in vitrines, and through through works of art, and of course the history of the Guernica, how Guernica became a symbol of the transition. This is Guernica when it was still in the Casón del Buen Retiro under a bulletproof glass, with of course the two civil guards, and when the bulletproof glass is then of course removed. And we have here the contextualization of Guernica with the pavilion, with Calder, and with newsreels of the period, with the theories of, with works by Renaud, with the whole discussion of how to be an artist during war and the importance of realism. So we have different elements antagonizing. We have one room where you have Miró, you have Picasso itself, you have Julio González with the artists, avant-garde artists dealing with the reality of the war. And also we have the area with Bardassano, with Horacio Ferrer, of the artists that have chosen realism. Realism that, as you could see in one case, it was linked to Soviet realism. In other case, it was linked to a more Spanish tradition. And of course also Goya, because if there was one artist that dealt with war, it was Goya. It was a reference, and we had included some of the disasters in the collection. And other artists, Gaia and Solana, because as we know at the time, the pavilion was propaganda about the Republic, but the Republic also wanted to detach itself from the Soviets. As already in the 30s, there was some ideas of what Stalin was doing. So it included Solana, an artist that was ambiguous in in his political affinities, and also an artist that for them represented Baroque, Spanish Baroque, that was a way to detach themselves from the Soviet pavilion. So that is next to Guernica, plus the exile. This is something that was not in the collections of Reina Sofia, is something that we had included, how the history of Spain is also the history of Spain in the exile, how the history of Spain is also the history of Mexico, Argentina. So you have Remedios Varo, you have there a film, Los Olvidados by Buñuel, and of course Picasso in France, Fernandez and Oscar Dominguez. And contextualizing with something which was important, the emergence, the appearance of world fairs at the time, the ideas of representing, the ideas of propaganda, the ideas of murals. So we do often temporary exhibitions that are linked with that. In this case, the idea, this is right below Guernica, of a mural by Léger that somehow relates to all those things. And we go to, so that's one chapter. The next chapter is the chapter of the 40s, chapter and 40s and 50s, the chapter during Franco. It's a chapter that starts after the end of the war, and in 1940, more or less, and it ends in 1967, when Franco created the first, what they call organic law, and it was a law by which it was clear that Franco was going to die in the bed. It was clear that the regime was going to legalize itself. So we want to see the situation of Spain, Europe, and the world at the time. So first, we try to reconstruct some of these, not all, are works that were in the 1958 pavilion in Venice Biennial by Tapies, Millares, Saura, Rivera. And they're somehow the first avant-garde after the war. It's also the first avant-garde that the Spanish regime uses abroad to demonstrate that there were freedoms and all those things in Spain. You will see also the characteristics of this type of work. Everything is very dark, everything is black and white, it's about gesture, about matter. And we contrapose that to the next room is abstract expressionism, which is just the opposite. And we try to put artists that somehow were influential to the Spanish artists. Of course, Motherwell, of course, Frank Klein, and of course, Clifford Steele. And artists that were also in the States, Esteban Vicente and Guerrero in the right side. But next to it, and this is an advance, it's not happened yet, that's the Cisneros collection, that's a temporary exhibition. A part of it will remain as comodato in the museum, and it will be next to these other two rooms. So you'll have next to Clifford Steele, next to Franz Klein, next to Tapia Saura, you'll have Elio Itizica, you'll have Lito, you'll have Maldonado, and you'll see how there are other modernities. You'll see how, while the modernity from Europe and the States maybe was coming from Miró, was coming from Picasso, was coming from other sources, you have in Latin America modernity coming from Max Bill, from Albers, from Mondrian, that we include in the exhibition. We see how Ligia Clark is questioning literally Mondrian, or also Elio Itizica. We see how gesture, how automatism, how the big field is changed by construction, is changed by space, is changed by the performative. Soto. And of course, a different chronology that would not fit in an area that is called 1940-1967. However, it's very important to see how the chronological developments are different in every place. So we have Gego of obviously much later. So this is the major narrative of this area. But then what about the micro stories? So then we have all this, and then we do a jump. In this case, we have two things. We have a film by Berlanga, Bienvenido, Mr. Marshall, Welcome, Mr. Marshall, that you all know, but you know the story, is a town in the center of Spain that is welcoming. They heard about Mr. Marshall coming, giving the Americans coming, giving money. So actually, so it's an irony about the political situation of the period, but it's more than that. This is how he is dreaming his life as a cowboy, but it is even more. This is in center Spain, but they dress as flamencos, they dress as people from the south, because that's what the image they expect the Americans they will have through it. So the film is also our perception, it's about us looking at the others and the others looking at us, it's about expectatives, it's about many things. And in addition to that, we have and that's also a jump in terms of narratives. We have La Codorniz. Of course, at the time, you have the great art that was anti-Franco, but somehow it was used by Franco to promote this idea of liberalism. But inside of Spain, you had other forms of resistance that had to do with humor, had to do with a comic, in this case, La Codorniz, a comic, a kind of humorous magazine. In that humorous magazine, several writers of the before the war got refuge. Several artists, several authors remained there to create an art of a work of resistance, and that's very important to understand the complexity of the period. And of course, this is Eugene Smith, how we were looked. Of course, this is also a construction, because Spain was like that, but it was not exactly like that. We know through documents of the period that I think it was Harper Magazine, they invited Eugene Smith, but with certain ideas. They wanted to show a dark idea of Spain, and of course, Spain was dark, but it was other things. So we have that, but at the same time, we have Català Roca looking at the Barcelona of the 50s and 60s when, at the time of Tapies and other artists were doing their work. And of course, we have also other changes, in this case, Rothko and Hitchcock, Rear Window, in which we have two discourses of perception, of viewing. The discourse of painting, and Hitchcock is also about viewing. It's about the importance of looking at that in this case is also political. It's about spying. So we have these two elements. And then we have sheets, we have derivas, we have elements that go through different lines. Oteiza, that somehow was separated of all these things, that instead of going to Paris and New York like many of the artists, decides to go to Latin America. So we have Oteiza with Weissman, or Oteiza with Ligia Pape at the end. And we see how also forms have, very often, different forms could have some ideas. So we have Sildo Meireles using the reticula, using the grid, using the cube, but to do political work already at that moment. And this is through a temporary exhibition, but eventually will be also in the collection. We have the political, when the mother project, both political and artistical, is cut by the different dictatorships that start in the 70s and run through the 80s, we have this other type of alternative practices, somehow getting some of the ideas of the modern narratives, but in a different, putting them obviously upside down, like in this case, and breaking the limits between art and art practice. This is Leon Ferrari. That reminds me of Bolaño, and questioning also the sexuality, the body. And that's also thinking about that. This is Principio Potosí. It's another temporary exhibition where we also deal with the idea of ambiguity of the work of art. The exhibition tried to put two things together. On the one hand, the fact that what Marx called the originary accumulation that starts in the 16th century with Potosí, with the accumulation of silver, and that was based on slavery, on the principle of the meta. And that's related to today's situation, where the world keeps growing, and it's also based in Dubai, in China, in different terms, in different forms of operation. In both cases, art has an ambiguous status. We know that art in Latin America, in this case, it had a pedagogical status. It was supposed to be done to convert and to educate people into the dogma, but it also was a way of questioning the status, because those paintings were used very often in rituals, were used very often in town fairs. So what the artist did, in this case, an exhibition curated by 2 artists, is to put this element in a different context, which is the museum, and turning the museum somehow in a fair, and putting those works with works of today that refer to the same principles. In this case, Farocchi, Rogelio López Cuenca, another Latin America and Spanish artist, Molinari. So this about narratives, and with this I will conclude. But that implies to be able to do this, it implies big changes in the museum. It implies changes in terms of the way we educate, especially when you have this kind of loose structure of narratives. The way people navigate through all those stories is different than a conductivist, a linear way of storytelling. And that implies also the acknowledgement that all the museums, all history, they are always fragmentary. They are never complete, and therefore you need always the others. That also means that maybe the encyclopedic museum that started in the 18th century makes no sense, or is entering into a crisis. And that means that probably the museum should unfold itself. Maybe it means that maybe it should unfold in a series of different institutions that have different type of legitimacy, different institutions that have different forms of constituencies, which are museums, which are archives, which are universities, places of debate. That means, as I said, that probably we have to question the idea of ownerships, and we have to start thinking in terms of being custodians and sharing, in terms of creating a kind of confederation, a kind of large community, a large community where we all share the stories and we all share the works. A large community where when you give, of course, when you receive, you get richer, but when you give also, because it's a community based on the dialogue, based on the reciprocity of knowledge and of storytelling. And that means also thinking of the collection probably as an archive, and I'm using the word in the way that Derrida used it, which is not only a place, is not only a place where you keep things, but is the law that rules the place, the law that rules the way we classify, the way we tell, the way we study, the way we conceive history. And that law is a law that has to be negotiated. It's a law that is common. And that means, and that goes also to the idea of modernity, in countries like Spain or in Latin America, where the principle of modernity was never really developed, where we had, of course, elites, where we have small enlightenment, and where modernity was always next to other forms of organization, maybe that's the alternative. Maybe also in a moment where, of course, the private normally is interested in the private, is interested in the benefit, whatever kind that benefit is. And the public, it has become, it behaves now like private. We all know in public museums that we are asked for visitors. We are asked for results in economical terms. It looks like doing projects that had to do with process. It looks like doing projects that had to do with education, real education. It looks like projects that are not spectacular, they are not interested because for the publics, because they are not popular enough. And in theory, culture belongs to the people in that sense. So in a moment where the distinction between private and public doesn't fit anymore, in a moment where the industries of communication have taken over, in a moment like in the Ballard novel where everything has become a commodity, maybe is the moment to question all this structure. And maybe it's the moment to think of the commons, to think of the idea of the commons, which is something that has to do with something that is being created continuously. It's a space of negotiation. It's a space where culture, art belongs to everybody. It's a space where knowledge is not expropriated from the start, and it's a place where things do not necessarily have to be spectacular. And is in that sense, or they don't are ruled by the element of the benefit. And is this element of the common, is this element of the network, is this element of a confederation, a constellation of institutions of different type of legitimacy, is this choral narrative, is this complex polyedric narrative. I think the narrative, I think the history, I think the type of institution, the form of relation in which maybe Spanish and Latin American art, especially Spanish, will be able to come out of the melancholic effect in which the crisis and the market and the global situation has situated us. Thank you.
We are now about to hear Mark Roglan, the Linda P. and William A. Custer Director of the Meadows Museum and Centennial Chair of the Meadows Museum School of the Arts in SMU. You know him well, and as you also know the great museum he directs. So let me just emphasize from a Spanish perspective that because of his intelligent strategic vision, this museum, housing such a wonderful collection of Spanish art, has ceased to be for us a hidden and remote treasure to become a very visible, very relevant and important reference for anybody willing to study Spanish art, as the museum covers a very long span of time from medieval to contemporary art. But it's also a crucial reference for anybody willing to study American collecting of Spanish art, and also how the American interest is expanding from Spanish to Latin American culture. He will explain this much better than me. After Mark Roglan, we will have the pleasure of listening to Ángel Kallenberg, former director of the Museo Nacional de Artes Visuales de Montevideo. The title of his presentation is clear enough, I think: Narratives of Latin American Art from Montevideo to Mainstream Art History. Without the patient, wise, sensitive work of Ángel Kallenberg as head of the Museo Nacional for several decades in Montevideo, we might not be aware of the centrality of such figures as Torres-Garcia or Barradas in the evolution of mainstream international modernism. This is a typical case study of how narratives and arguments may shift in art history and market according to why, how, and when the tale of art history is told, and by whom, of course. So let's listen after Mark, Ángel Kallenberg.
Well, thank you everybody for being here today. And the topic of my talk is going to be about the Meadows Museum and what a story, a very linear narrative, a little more positive, with less melancholy than the one Manolo was telling just a minute ago. But just to try to bring up to date about where we were, where we are, and where we're going. And basically, I was saying there's a linear narrative, and it's going to be like, I'm going to divide the lecture like in 3 parts, because it's really hard to understand where we are and where we're going without starting from where we come. which is the pillars on which the institution is based. You probably know the story of Alger Meadows. He's the person on which the whole collection starts from. He was born in Vidalia, became a very prosperous oil businessman that decided in the 1950s to expand his vision and become global. And he went to Madrid, and he would stay every year at the Ritz for 2 months. The reason he would stay there was to hear, hopefully to get good news from all his prospections. He did prospections all over the country, even in the Spanish Sahara, and move on with his business of oil. But being in the Ritz, he spent 2 months every year. He would spend a lot of time with the museum that's across the Ritz, which is the Prado Museum. And with time, he fell in love with the Spanish art, and he decided that he wanted to do something very special. And in 1965, he decided, being a trustee of Southern Methodist University in SMU, he decided to give the collection to the university and also the monies and the funds to build the museum. What I'm showing here is the museum when it was originally featured, which is this box, part of the Owens Art Center, just over here. So that was the space that was inaugurated in 1965. And he, in 1968, was asked by a member of the Houston Chronicle, what do you want to do? And he said, yes, I mean, as I said originally, to build a small Prado in Texas. So here you go, a man with small vision, no? He just woke up one day, got the phone, there was a member from the press asking, what do you want to do? And he was saying, I want to do a small Prado for Texas. He had the means, he had the interest, and he felt like he was in the position to make that happen. So he put himself to work. Here we see an image of Alger Meadows inaugurating the museum in 1965. Beautiful, charming building. The designer is a modernist based here in Dallas. And everybody came. We even have chronicles that Mrs. Meadows was wearing a pink Balenciaga the day that the museum opened. And the collection started to grow. First, in the 1950s, he bought especially a lot in Spain. And some of the works that we see here, some of them are still in the collection, some are not. For example, the one in the center was thought to be a Piombo. We still have it in the collection, and it's a copy of Piombo. And some other paintings are still in the collection, like that beautiful painting by Esquivel. And others were The Accession. And some others, like this one, was bought, for example, as an El Greco. And it's a painting that still remains in the collection that later on was found out that it wasn't by El Greco. He was a great man of vision, but also a great man when it came to do things large. Not so much with the Spanish collection, but as you probably all know, he also collected French Impressionism and modern art. And especially it was in that area where he was more misfortune because basically two crooks took advantage of him and sold him paintings, especially from Emile de Ory, very important forger, and also by other paintings that were not by Picasso, Modigliani, etc. But it's interesting because what will happen during those years is that basically the institution will put a lot of attention in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in the collection. And the collection was very focused, which is quite extraordinary. It was going to be a collection of Spanish art. And it was going to encompass from medieval times to the present in a way that had rarely been seen before. So major works, for example, of Juan de Borgoña from the 16th century were secured for the collection. Works from the 17th century by many artists, including this wonderful Two Saints by Murillo, were secured for the collection. Or the Yard of Madmen, which was bought in Wildenstein, paintings from the 18th century, Goya, was brought to the collection. Or 19th century, Luz Jiménez Aranda. Or even from the 20th century, this wonderful Miro from the 20s, this masterpiece of Queen Maria Luisa of Prussia, which was bought by Miro directly in the Pierre Matisse Gallery to Miro himself. It's a Miro that was chosen by Miro for the Meadows collection. This is really extraordinary because really what he was setting up is a collection that it's really unique in many ways because it really encompassed the whole period. I mean, it goes all the way from medieval times to the art of today. Some collections stop earlier, some start later. In this case, encompass the whole period. So in some ways, thinking with the standards of the Prado, thinking and making a great collection of Spanish art and putting this range just set the platform for the museum to grow. And that, I just wanted to bring two images because I do think that's important to see, especially from the 60s to 78 when he dies, the range, how his taste also changed. This is what is thought to be the first painting he bought for the Meadows collection. This beautiful painting, a salon painting from the 1877 that was in the Salon in Paris, and the first painting that's supposed to be bought of Spanish art by Meadows, to this incredible Velázquez, the Queen Margarita of Austria, which was bought at the end of his life. That's, I would say, is the first chapter of the lecture I wanted to talk today, because that will really settle the way the museum will go into a second phase. So the collection had been there. There have been wonderful exhibitions, some of them very important, like a Melendez still life exhibition that took place in the 80s. But the museum, there was this kind of incredible vision in the late 90s and early, especially in the late 90s, with a group of leaders from the university, as well as from the community, sat down and decided to build this new building. It's a building that is 6 times or more larger than the original building that was in the Owen Center. And it was a building that was meant to almost like suited for the collection, which is something we see very rarely too. Usually museums, collections happen, they come to a building, you deal with the collections. In this case, this building was almost made for the collections to be hung in, which is quite extraordinary. Here what we see is also how first, also this wonderful work by Calatrava was added in 2002, and how basically the platform from which to create a museum, meaning with exhibitions, with programming, publications, etc., was put together. Here we have a moment of the opening in 2001. On the left, we see the president of the university and his wife, and in the center and on the right, we see the governor of Texas, then still today, and his wife, Anita Perry. And in the center, we see kings Juan Carlos and Queen Reina Sofia. I always like to say that this is a collection that brings kings to Texas, and no any other kings but the kings of Spain. So the kings came just to Dallas, just to the opening of the new Meadows Museum, just because of the collection and this terrific new building. Here we have several images. The plaza was just remodeled in 2009, and other works of art with feature, like this one by Plensa. And basically, the presence of the museum became, in many ways, like the lobby, like the foyer of the university with the community. So it's where the university itself merges with the community. In many ways, the Meadows Museum was able to provide that. And the galleries. From those small galleries, we got this incredible building where we could hang the collections in one section of the building on the second floor with this wonderful natural light, on the other and not, with all the kind of high technology that is required, and really making the collection look as it never had looked before. Also, as we see that changes had happened in the museum, we can also see that the city had changed. It's very different, the Dallas of 1965 to the Dallas of today, of 2000. And the city grew, and the university wants to be part of that growth. One of the 5 largest metroplex in the country, with a growing population, especially in the Latino section, that's close now to 50%. Here we have an image of Dallas today. Also a very vigorous city, with a lot of interest. When you think about it, it's not normal to find half a dozen of cultural institutions that have just merged in the last 10 years. And they continue happening. The Perot Center just opened just a few months ago. And I had to put this shot. I mean, Calatrava is part of the DNA in many ways of the Meadows Museum. And we just opened this bridge last year, and he came to the museum for the opening of the bridge. Beautiful bridge that will be joined, this is the Margaret Hunt Bridge, that will be joined very soon by the Margaret McDermott Bridge. And I wanted to talk about what to do. So once we started, we had this incredible building, then we needed to fill it up with content. And we focused especially in doing exhibitions, some of them larger than others. But for example, we paid a lot of attention also in doing collaborations, hopefully to be done in long term. This is a whole series that probably many of you saw of paintings that Fernando Gallego, a Castilian painter from the 15th century, had done. They're crest pictures that were given to the Tucson Museum of Art and that were put together for the first time and studied in depth by the Meadows Museum with the collaboration of the Kimball Art Museum, with which we did all the infrareds and all the studies. So we did focus exhibitions, such as the one of Fernando Gallego, but also we've done exhibitions that rank within the decorative arts. This is a whole series of tapestries that we bought from the 18th century that were commissioned by Philip V, describing the legend of Don Quixote. King Philip V of Spain, coming from the Bourbons, decided when he was in his youth in Paris to write a new chapter of Don Quixote. And that new chapter that never was published, of course, was part of the exhibition. But also, one of the first things he did when he got to Spain was, I want to have a whole series based on Don Quixote. It was a wonderful show. We also did with Patrimonio Nacional this incredible show on Charles IV and all his collecting, a show that was first in the Royal Palace and then came to the Meadows. And also, we have brought private collections in Spain and also in Latin America. This one is the Pérez Simón collection, a collector in Mexico City. And we brought this wonderful collection, the Chronique de Monet exhibition that was organized by the Thyssen and then came to the Meadows with Pre-Raphaelite paintings, Bouguereau's, Monet, Cézanne's, etc., as well as the Avillot collection that was very kind to also we did with the Thyssen Museum, and they were able to lend this wonderful Degas, Van Goghs, etc. Also, although Spanish art, of course, has been something we've been very interested in, and also we've been very interested in working with in the whole area collecting. We are Meadows. We're basically the result of the taste of one collector. We also have been very interested in looking into Latin America. And one of the, I think, with bringing the painting of New World exhibition with Denver, and then doing this exhibition that we organized on Diego Rivera and the Cubist portraits, we were very pleased to be able to bring under the same roof all the Diegos that Diego painted from 1913 to 1917, but 3. So it was a great opportunity just to see how Diego was working in Paris during this period from 1913 and 1917. And that's the infamous painting that he said, he mentioned that Picasso was copying him. And he got him in a lot of trouble. We also done fashion, like Balenciaga and His Legacy, a wonderful show in 2006. And we like to do exhibitions like Balenciaga, which we think are historically important, and they are very appealing. It's an incredible connection between the greatest Spanish designer, probably that ever existed, and also Texas itself. Many of these gowns came from UNT, and they were bought and done by designers. And we're not, I mean, we were talking before about numbers of people coming and going to museums and how important that is, and how maybe not that important it is, because this will be an exhibition, for example, that is broken the record of attendance when it went to the Meadows Museum of all times. On the other hand, Fernando Gallego is the exhibition that probably the publication got more important appeal from scholars all over the world. So we were interested in it. And we also interested in contemporary art. This was an exhibition we organized, putting our Spanish art collection in the context of modern art and how the Spanish school is still, in many ways, is looked at by contemporary artists from Curran to Manuel Valdés or Struth, no, on the top. There was a Ballester just in the... So we like to also come and see the collection in different ways. And when it comes to exhibitions, we're really open to everything and anything. And that has the same quality and importance as the Meadows collection. This is an exhibition we also organized with Italy. It was, it's the most important exhibition ever done in America on Etruscan art. And I want to make a point here because Manolo brought to our attention the importance of collaboration. This is the result of collaboration. And I'm a true believer that the future for museums is in making these collaborations happen, especially long-term, ongoing collaborations. And this exhibition is the result of that, and also the result of us being part of SMU. The exhibition was organized and curated by a professor of SMU. His name is Greg Warden, Dr. Greg Warden. And basically, he came to us saying, like, look, SMU has a dig in northern Italy that we've been working on for more than 30 years. And it would be nice to do an exhibition on Etruscan art. Well, that led to conversations with the National Archaeological Museum in Florence and all the Tuscan museums. And suddenly we started to discuss not doing a small little show, but they were willing to lend everything and anything just to do a major exhibition with all these scholars in America. So the show came to the Meadows. It was the first time, for example, that pediment was ever lent, and it was just a major publication that came out of the whole result. But it wasn't because of the Meadows Museum. It wasn't because of our collection. We drew upon the context and the relationship that Greg had built during 30 plus years. And I remember talking to colleagues, museum directors here in America, in a moment that, for example, there was a lot of pressure, especially from the Italians, to repatriate works of art. So there was a huge discussion of how to avoid that. And this was brought as a great example of how you can create really great relationships when it comes to this kind of situations when you have ongoing relationship. So having SMU, a dig in Florence for 30 years, year after year, all the things that surface from that dig going to the Italian patrimony set the base of a wonderful relationship of which one definitely took advantage. This is some of the works that came from the dig that SMU has there, but it was put in a much larger context, which was the Etruscan large exhibition. We also have done exhibitions with the Freer Gallery in Washington. These are 6th century Buddhist sculptures that we brought from all over the world. And because also we're part of a university. So we have this university sense of having to reach all areas and all people. And this was, again, of the highest quality. There was all this incredible cavern that was made technologically, reproducing the caverns that were in China. And basically a great project in which the University of Chicago was trying to get the different pieces from different sculptures that had been removed in the early 20th century and replace them thanks to technology. We have not forgotten about the collection, and we continue collecting only Spanish art, and we'll continue collecting only Spanish art. We're very focused on that. All our funds are restricted to Spanish art. Our donors, the Meadows Foundation, especially wants the collection on Spanish art to continue being polished. It's like a diamond, no, that you continue polishing. So we've been able to continue getting works of art that will enhance the collection during this last 13 years. Like this one by Rechac, this one by Pantoja de la Cruz, we think. This one by El Greco, that was just after the building opened. Carreño de Miranda, this was in Maastricht just a few years ago. Portrait of Charles II. This wonderful terracotta was recently bought by Villabrile, sculptor from Castile, that will be soon unveiled, is shown in the collections. Miniatures by Melendez, a woman artist working in the 18th century in the court of Charles IV. We have bought an important portrait of Mead by Vicente Lopez, a painting that represents an American collector from the early 18th century. It's a Meadows 100 years earlier that made all his business in the south of Spain, and that basically the first Murillos that came, documented that came to America, came with his collection. Martin Rico, at the base of the exhibition that's now in the museum, and especially we have centered a lot of efforts in 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century art with works by Beruete, Mir, Regoyos, Sorolla, Desanglada, which is Paris in 1903, the Moulin Rouge, Blanchard, Julio González, drawings, Saura, Chirino, Calatrava, and Jaume Plensa, the first head that he did using all these irons. But also we get a lot of donations, and we're really interested in doing that, including this wonderful Coronel or this Elena Escobedo. So we're very interested through especially donations to grow the collections of Latin American art and other schools. We're very interested in doing research and doing all the conservation that needs to be done. This is a very interesting result when we were doing the acquisition of this painting, of this sculpture, the finger came off. And that was great because we were able to do TL testing. So we were able to find the exact date when the sculpture was done. So now we know it's from 1715 to 1800. So that provides us even more certainty about when the sculptures were done. These are some of the x-rays. We partner with the Children's Hospital. It's so interesting. And we love to do this kind of things. The sculpture we wanted to do x-rays. It's in terracotta, so it's extremely fragile. So we call the Children's and they say, we'll send you an x-ray team that will do the x-ray. So we call them and this is the result, which was terrific. Also, we've done things with the Kimball, well, as I mentioned before, with the Fernando Gallego. Also, the museum has evolved enormously when it comes to education. We have incredible programs in SMU, but also with the community. Thousands of children come with buses to see the exhibitions and the collection today. This is my associate director did this, and I love it. Hey, publications. And this is also very important. Although exhibitions were done in that first stage, it's really publications. We've done enormous advances in areas that are more popular, like, I don't know, like Velázquez, or areas that are less popular, maybe Esteban Vicente, or we're interested in what it really comes down to is like if you do, for example, research on Martín Rico, the book you're going to find the latest in English today in America is from 1933. So for us to do an exhibition of Martín Rico and to be able to do a publication and update all of that, it's very important for us because we help, promote and make sure that people that are interested in late 19th century or in Rico or this art from this time will be able to find these publications available. Also with Diego Rivera or Velázquez, it was very interesting to find out that we had a half a dozen of beautiful Velázquez here in the Meadows, and the largest concentration of Velázquez before that did not happen till 1989 when the Met did their exhibition on Velázquez. So sometimes time goes by, and these publications help further understanding and appreciation of Spanish art as well as other areas. We are very interested in ongoing long-term relationships. I brought that before. This is the one we forged 4 years ago with the Prado Museum, in which everything started very small with the loan of that wonderful El Greco by Pentecost, and that just organically grow now to bring these exhibitions that are being shown both in Madrid and Dallas, and that will continue next year when we do the exhibition with the Spanish drawings from the Kunsthalle in Hamburg that will be shown first in Madrid, first in Dallas, and then will be seen in Madrid. I mean, this is like, it's so positive because the staffs of both institutions get to know each other and the relationship, and goes back with Manolo was saying about long-term collaborations. That's the key for success, and it does work. Also, we have a great long-term collaboration with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. What we see here is that wonderful major altarpiece with other pictures that have been here on loan for 10 years. As you all know, Boston was closing galleries because the Foster building was being constructed, so they were like in a pickle and said like, well, what do we do with our Spanish art collection? So they called us and said, would you be interested in showcasing while we're going through construction? Instead of putting it in storage and being there for 10, 12 years, we said, okay, we'll bring it down, we'll hang it with the permanent collection, and it's been here for the last 10 years or 12 years, and it's very possible that will stay for a few years more. But it's a wonderful, also ongoing relationship that then when, for example, they need Goyas from our collection or we need Velázquez for their, it makes things much easier. I mean, and this is another case that just came a couple weeks ago and it's in the galleries now. This is a dark image, it's awful. The painting is fantastic. It's a Valdez Leal that just came from the Santa Barbara Museum of Art and is on long-term loan for 5 to 6 years. And they wanted to do, it's a bequest that they got. They're really into contemporary art, but they really felt like if the Meadows wanted it, we would take it. And it's wonderful. And I could not avoid bringing the Villalpando to the right. Because, you know, we try to make all those connections through programming and through exhibitions themselves to try to bring the kind of dialogues, no, between the art of Spain and other art. Well, saying all of this is like, I do feel like in this last decade plus, the museum just basically being very focused on the collection, thanks to the construction of the new building and all the programming and all the exhibitions and all the publications and all the educational efforts, has really become a museum operating of all different kind of levels. And I think that that progression will continue, and we'll see really great results from that. But the question is, like, where do we go next? And I think that one of the things that we're most excited is about what we're doing right now. This is the first time, at least in the 13 years I've been here, that there's an international symposium with 10 scholars for 2 days just talking and discussing about art. This is huge for us. I mean, it's the first time, but we don't want it to stop there. We want to have much more of this coming to the Meadows and being part of that kind of ongoing organic and learn about art and collecting. We want to do continue with research and education and helping. We have a great program with Connections. It's called Connections and Beyond Sight. Our education department is doing enormous strides in learning from how to help with disabilities, people that may be blind, people that may have Alzheimer's, maybe people that had other kinds of challenges, how to make art available to them. But it's not just try to incorporate something that's been done, has been successful. It's about research. It's about what can we find that can make that experience be better. And that will pay also enormous dividends. And we'll have, hopefully, symposiums and bring scholars and experts in education from all over the world and learn about what we discover. Also, and here we see some of the people really in Braille or working through the collections. One thing also we're very excited about, we're working on reopening the restaurant. And make it, but we don't want to just sell sandwiches or do something like that. We just want to have it and be like a food destination and really be part of the culture of Spain. I mean, and really explore and bring chefs. If you think about it, there's like cuisines that are being opened all over the world with this great I think that Spain is, again, number one. The number one restaurant was just voted in Spain. But we want people to explore culture in all kind of levels and just have you know, from a real paella, which is what is being cooked there, to really Spanish great wines, etc. So that's what we're working for, and hopefully by the end of this year, we will move forward with that. We were just allowed from the university the possibility of offering to whoever operates the restaurant the possibility of selling wine and beer, and that has put us in a different situation in order to make it operational. I just had to bring her. I don't know. I mean, I saw her and I said, there's where you fit. With research, again, that's something we're paying a lot of attention. We have fellows that are coming every year. We're training them here. They're going to Europe. They're being trained as well there. And we hope that also will help make the future leaders and the future curators and scholars of tomorrow. Also, we're very interested in expanding the global footprint through exhibitions. We have already mentioned the Rico exhibition in the Prado, or the one that we did with the National Library of Spain of the Códice of the Sistine Chapel that went to both venues. We want to increase that, and like in December with the Sorolla in America exhibition, that exhibition will be in Dallas. We'll go to San Diego, California, and then we'll be seen in Madrid. So we're really interested in working on that. We're very interested in developing also programs inside SMU. I mean, this is something that we have that makes us unique. We are a Spanish art collection. We have a great facility. We have all this great staff creating all this great programming, doing all these great things, exhibitions, etc. But also we're part of a larger university. We have a great art history department. We have other areas of humanities, but also we have business, and we also have areas of law, theology, engineering. So we're really looking into trying to bring all those things together. Why not partner with the business school and create like programs on how about leadership with people with MBA programs, etc., and arts administration, etc. Why not work closely with the business also school and talk about how Spanish companies and other companies that come to make business in America, how that can be successful in an environment where it's important for companies that understand the whole area of philanthropy and how nonprofit works in America. That will make them more successful and also will make us more effective. So we're thinking about different ways of how to integrate that, and hopefully in the future and the next years we'll see this kind of initiatives unveiling. And we also want to bring and make relationships not only with museums, but also with our university, so also with universities here in Latin America and elsewhere. And I would say that the final here's our president, one of those days, with all the family. And I think that what I wanted to conclude is just saying that I would say that the final goal for the Meadows Museum is to become the center for Spanish art in America, an institution where anyone that's interested in the art of Spain and its culture will come and become an active participant. Thank you.
In 1966, I proposed Tom Messer, the director of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, an exhibit of Torres-Garcia. His answer was very synthetic. Send me 150 black and white photographs. Finally, he approved the exhibitions 4 years later. But he devoted only a single ring in his museum, the same space that he granted for a young Polish artist forgotten long ago. Hilton Kramer was then the art critic for the New York Times. Allow me to quote some excerpts of his commentary of that exhibition. He said, "The exact extent of which his art may be said to belong aesthetically to the culture of South America or to his native Uruguay is still unclear, whereas his profound depth to the European avant-garde is only too obvious." Again, these pictures certainly align themselves with a kind of Mondrian's-derived abstraction that began to make itself felt in Paris in the 30s. With a defender like Torres-Garcia, Mondrian needed no enemies, concluded Hilton Kramer. And I say in addition, with friends like Hilton Kramer, Latin American art did not need enemies. Only two exceptions for the time. The unforgettable Clem Greenberg wrote 1949 in his article about all over art that he had to include Torres-Garcia. And my dearest Doré Ashton wrote at the New York Times in the year 60s, in a review of the exhibition that Torres-Garcia made at the Rose Fried Gallery, that he thought was a spiritual one. We have to remember this key word. That was, moreover, the trend of international criticism of the time, that Latin American art was derivative. My generation, the dinosaurs generation, had to fight against this kind of misreadings in order to make visible the hidden face of our artistic production. First of all, we have to remember that our geometric abstract art was created within a Latin American context, and this is not a minor issue. And we have to take in account the assessment of Octavio Paz in his essay, Use and Contemplation, a very brilliant essay. He said, the history of modern art can be divided into two currents, the contemplative and the combative. To the first belong tendencies such as Cubism and abstract art. To the second, movements such as Futurism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. Then, with characteristic eloquence, he proposes the following aphoristic duality, mysticism and the creative, and the exquisite. That is to say, for European, the artistic object had become an autonomous and self-contained reality whose meaning did not seek to go beyond the work itself and had ended in a reflection upon painting on the threshold of autism, whereas for a Latin American the artistic object retained vestiges of a transcendent meaning. Since the Industrial Revolution, the work of art in the First World has become just one object among other objects in a context of overproduction. In Latin America, however, the mecanophilia of Leger is transmuted into organicism in works like those of the Brazilian Tarsila de Amaral, or into cosmic transcendence as the work of Torres-Garcia. This is a drawing I discovered in the middle of the 60s, in which the word Yod He Vav He designates the sacred name, and with those 4 letters, he built a drawing of the universal man. This has to be also with spirituality. This is the Hebrew Kabbalah. And also, Latin Americans had to do with cosmogony, like in Tamayo's work. For the ancients, as well as for the Pre-Columbians, the movement of the stars and planets and the harmony of the cosmos provided an image of perfection, and their works could only be conceived with reference to that reality. In the same essay, Paz alludes to centrality of an imperturbable creative activity in the age of craftsmanship, less pretentious than great art, but deeply rooted in that cosmic harmony. Thus, in Latin American artistic production, we rarely find abstract, geometric, aniconic, non-objective art that embraces the mechanical, that prioritizes a technique, or that aspires to be equivalent of the mechanically produced objects. We are more likely to find a refinement that is closer to that of Latin American ancestral creations, which defends us from the unifying function of technique and from geometrical deserts. In short, what we have before us in a geometric abstract art that no longer believes in the abstract religion of progress and the quantitative vision of the man and nature. It is a geometric abstract art that in our developing countries was very cognizant of the ultimately ruinous character of industrial overproduction. At the heart of Latin American geometric abstract art, we can find a fidelity to craft, which is a sign of health and which prevents us our products from being mere displays of a faith in the technological miracles or a belief in infinite progress. Herbert Reed observed that this strain of abstract or geometric art has a sensibility that approximates the ideals of Neolithic artists. It is a non-imitative art, an art which necessarily progresses from the contemplation of geometric forms to nature, geometric art which passes from ceramic vessels to architecture. Perhaps it is the affinity that Oswald de Andrade finds between the manifestations of the Middle Eastern, Neolithic, and Pre-Columbian art. The recognition of the art of Torres-Garcia lends eloquently testimony of that. Let us not forget that in his first logo, for the Association of Constructive Art, this same cosmic perspective visualizes the silhouette of the Latin America, the triangle, of the Latin American continent, emblematically in the geometry of a triangle, South America inscribed on the circular contour of the Earth. Later, in 1943, he published a map on South America with the south pointing north and accompanied by the phrase, our north, that is, our aim or objective is the south. No one can doubt the extreme abstraction he employed in both drawings, without, however, losing his strong connection to the profound American reality. As claimed by Jack the Ripper, we have to go step by step. Torres-Garcia from south to north. In the beginning, there was Torres-Garcia. His return around 1934 heralded the emergence of Europe's formalist movements in Montevideo, Cubism, Neoplasticism, and Constructivism. Mondrian, the European, in his enthusiasm for technique, achieved the maximum degree of abstraction, thus bringing painting to its degree zero. Torres-Garcia, on the other hand, preferred to establish his own logic and narrative, which allowed his abstract lines to operate on a tangible support. In his abstraction, there are always residues of the reality from which they are drawn. The posture is very Latin American and could never be the result of a culture in its final stage. As many believed the culture represented by Mondrian to be, Torres-Garcia is situated in the early stages of another culture. In this sense, Torres-Garcia pictorial praxis is based on a mannerist alternation, the coexistence of abstract and the tangible and the organic. This is a painter who has been exhibited in Borja Villiers' exhibition. In this painting, Torres-Garcia creates a perceptible chiaroscuro that, by decontextualizing the object, turns into an abstraction. Simultaneously, he allows us to see the peculiar characteristic of the pictorial pigment, calling attention to the materiality of the paint. Likewise, he makes no attempt to hide his brush strokes and the sensibility of the hand that holds the brush. Also, by not completely covering the support, he allows its natural color to show through, and thus the support, ordinarily passive, contributes a note of color to the finished composition. Unlike Mondrian, who sought to denature the painting, the material, the color, and anything else that could suppose a reference to nature, he neither fears nor flees nature, and thus, feeling no need to dispense with craftsmanship, he always remains loyal to the tradition of Velázquez painting. Over the course of thousands of pages of text, conferences, and exhibitions, the Uruguayans sought to articulate an imaginary museum of Latin American art, starting from the origins of humanity and searching for the connecting links. On his path, he attempted to provide a context of continuity for the arts of the continent by inventing a tradition. Torres introduced abstract art and created constructive universalism. He anticipated kinetic art since he added movement through the use of the pinwheel, that solar and cosmic reference to the neoplasticism of Mondrian, his course in Europe, and kinetic art is the art of movement. The range of Torres-Garcia teachings spreads from south to north. Near the end of the 40s, his ideas found an echo in an artistic group from the River Plate region, Madrid, some of whose most notable members included were Uruguayans like Ardenkin, Rothfuss and Ardenkin, who claimed to be his disciples, while the nationalized Argentine Cosicha recognized his early influences. In 1953, Torres-Garcia's work was exhibited at the second Sao Paulo Biennial, and a few years later, Brazil would become the site of the dispute between the concretists and the neo-concretists, increasingly oriented towards, in the opinion of Brazilian critic Frederico Moraes, whereas the concretism of Sao Paulo was increasingly oriented towards orthodox positions, a closer relationship with European models, in its enthusiastic adherence to the machine and to technology, the neo-concretists of Rio de Janeiro assumed humanist positions that value individual expression and the body. During the same years, Otero, Soto, and Cruz Diez inaugurated a construction in Venezuela. Thank you. This is Otero painting, colorism. And Soto and Cruz Diez inaugurated constructivism in Venezuela, although Colombia and Mexico were slow to embrace geometric abstraction. By the 60s, the work of sculptors like Ramirez Villamizar and Negret brought Colombia fully into this artistic current. Not until the late 60s did a handful of Mexican artists following in the wake of Tamayo attempting to move beyond their fixation with neorealism, and who had Matthias Gerritz, considered by Badcock an antecedent of minimal art, as a referent. Constructivism was a language that, in its numerous manifestations, was destined to become a continental tradition. It may be asked, to what extent was this development due to the influence of the Uruguayan Torres-Garcia? Pérez Barreiro, at the end of a study of the group Madrid, affirms that Torres-Garcia teachings, which were religiously followed in Uruguay, are treated irreverently by the avant-garde of Buenos Aires. Documents demonstrate, however, that although he was not followed by the Argentine avant-garde, neither did it universally reject him. The artists of the Madrid group recognized him as an antecedent. The opposite occurred with the members of the Asociación Arte Concreta Invención. In the second issue of the Bulletin from December 1946, a text called Torres-Garcia Against Modern Art, probably written by Tomás Maldonado and his brother Edgar Bailey, declared, I quote, "What is really happening is that Torres-Garcia is incapable of appreciating the deep and emotional meaning that palpitates on a white lacquered washable surface. Both constructive art and painting are placed by Torres-Garcia under the patronage of the golden ratio, a 200-500-year-old philosophy, and forgetting or ignoring the newest conquest of modern science." End of the quote. Maldonado's group came from Latin America, but it sought to associate itself with Europe. It came from a period of handicrafts, but it wanted to embrace the technological age. It saw Torres-Garcia like an apostate. Nevertheless, in Arte Madrid number 3, Buenos Aires, 1944, one reads, "Madrid pays homage to Torres-Garcia, who was the indisputable master of constructivism." And Košice himself, in his article, "Non-Figurative Art Trends in Latin America," concedes it must be recognized that the majority of the terrain had been prepared by the Uruguayan painter Torres-Garcia. His constructivist workshop exerted a great influence on the young artists of that period. Somewhat later, Aldo Pellegrini, an important Argentine art critic, in a chapter dedicated to concrete art in Argentina, resolved the controversy thus, quote, "The beginning of geometric art in Argentina was in 1944 by the appearance of the only issue of the magazine Arturo in Buenos Aires, which brought artists and poets together. Contributors to the publication included Arden Quinn, Košice, and Maldonado. These artists completely turned their backs on the country's pictorial antecedents, but quite rightly recognized the notable Uruguayan artist Torres-Garcia, one of the most creative and originally painters born on American soil, as their precursor. The roots of geometric abstraction. The emergence of abstraction, writes Mayer Shapiro, made it possible to enjoy the remotest arts, end of the quote. The formalist concerns of many of the Western artists at the beginning of the 20th century determined to experiment with abstraction, led them initially to explore the sculptural qualities of African art, the geometric structures of pre-Columbian art, and the color of the Pacific Islands, as well as popular art, which is to say all the arts that had previously been considered primitive. The Europeans, Klee, Moore, and Albers, and they were not alone, utilized aspects of the pre-Columbian visual grammar. Max Raphael called it colonization of the forms, in which the constructive element was very clear. Abstract stone, the rust forms, this is an Incaic rust form, the characteristic cut of stones, all of these elements comprised a syntaxis peculiar to itself. Torres did not imitate pre-Columbian art, rather he appropriated its rhythms, especially that of the terraced signs. You could see it as an alternative to the fretwork, which he used as a kind of generating unit and through which he rendered his constructive structures more dynamic. neither Torres-Garcia nor geometric abstraction in Latin America display thematic influences from pre-Columbian art. They make use of such elements as the stone arrangements of Sacsayhuaman, where the famous 12-angled stone contains within itself a balance among the tangible, the organic, and the abstracts. Thus, the theme of bands that appears in the work of Venezuelan Soto and Cruz Diez and the Brazilian Judith Landau may be associated with pre-Columbian textiles. The sense of space achieved by Soto and Cruz Diez, the use of bands and their lines produces a singular topology comparable to the dialectic of the distribution of warp and weft, and this gives their geometric forms a certain softness. Art Concreta Invención versus Madrid. The Argentine avant-gardes came together around the magazine Arturo and then separated into Arte Concreta Invención and Madrid. In the first issue of the magazine of Arte Concreta Invención, we read, "We began therefore by breaking the traditional shape of the picture. We then turned our attention to the recortado cut, cuadro recortado and marco recortado, cutaway picture frame, as we choose to call it. In this way, we had opened the floodgates, and that space had penetrated the picture, participating as one more element aesthetically belligerent. The painting, which had been born with the notion of picture windows and which had the frame as its boundary, suggested the idea of two distinct realities, the one virtual inside the frame and the other physically outside it. With the appearance of the gold frame, the difference between the two realities became exacerbated. By contrast, the painting of the Madrid artist saw direct contact with daily life and aimed to transcend the dichotomy between the two realities. Rothfuss's theory of the cutaway frame may be considered an anticipation of the hard edge and the shaped canvas, and the later developments, such as minimal and conceptual. The perspectivists, such Loza and Maldonado, this is Loza, Maldonado, himself suppressed the represented background, preferring to inject their forms into a real space on a wall, painting the emphasis of on perception in the years of the growing popularity of the Gestalt psychology. Concretist versus neo-concretist. In 1952, constructivism came to the public attention in Sao Paulo through the version offered by Max Bill. This was the concreto version of constructivism. The neo-concretists in Rio de Janeiro opposed to the Sao Paulo tendency, asserting that rationalism robs art of all autonomy and replaces the untransferable qualities of a work of art with notions of scientific objectivity. In short, for neo-concretists, the participation of the spectator and the concept of the work of art as a living organism, taken of course from Susan Langer's concept, constitute the two main themes of their aesthetic project. Max Bill, Lygia Clark's, Bichos, critters, maybe they could be called, are articulated sculptures equipped with a specific number of movements that reacts to the spectator's manipulations. Their parts are functionally interrelated as if they were parts of a living organism, a totally existential integration between the piece and us. These are objects on an intimate scale, distinctly anti-monumental. Monumentalism is, in this case, conceptual and not related to scale. If we contrast them with the sculpture of Calder, we would see that when he starts from the movement of a branch on a tree, he does not merely make use of technology to imitate it. Nevertheless, his work presupposes mechanics and industry. By contrast, Ligia explores the various topological choices for the surfaces, superimposition, interpenetration, folds, and curves. In Ligia Papi's engravings, textiles, the incisions describe geometric forms related to the segmentation of stones in the pre-Columbian architecture and its various projective points of view. These geometric shapes cohabit with the disquieting revelation of the support material, wood. The bodies created by OITC are painted wood or transparent boxes that reveal color as mass in the form of pigment, earth, powder, liquid, and even clothing packed inside, conceived of as an energy center, expressing a manifestation of color in space. At this point, it is permissible to establish a parallel between his work and that of the Arte Povera movement, that of Beuys, and even to consider it anticipatory of the work of Wolfgang Leib. OITC's painting 9 is structured around 7 wide vertical bars, each one fragmented in a different place, thus producing 7 squares, one per bar, sometimes wider, sometimes narrower than the bar it has broken off from and slightly tilted with respect to the verticality of these bars. What we have before us, it's not merely a case of fragmented bars, but rather qualitative variations that resist mechanical regularity. For this reason, this ostensible self-reflective painting could well be read as a crucifixion expressed in the language of geometrical bars. Abstraction. This is Miro Schendel with Paz. Camargo. Camargo's work are covered with pieces of wooden cylinders, some short, some long, encrusted at different angles and uniformly painted white. Homage to the spirit of Malevich? Maybe. Malevich's white has a mystical dimension. It's a luminous white. On the contrary, Camargo's white reliefs never entirely renounce reality. His explorations seek to illuminate the relationships between volume and plane, between empty and full, in a way that is similar to what Pierre Boulez attempted in his piece, Le Marteau sans Maître, with regard to silence and sound. The chiaroscuro, seen in the volumes of his wooden stems or his stems made from Carrara marble, in allusion to Greek Pentelic marble, maybe, defines a sort of Modiglianesque drawing. Burle Marx, using vegetables and minerals, broadened the abstract repertoire, creating an organic geometry, and Kosich evolved from Madi toward organicism with his experiments with water in the 40s, an evolution which would culminate with the creation of his hydrospatial town. Kinetic art. Pérez Oramas wrote that the neo-constructivist and objective tradition, which having kinetic art as in its main current, may well constitute the only strong thought to emerge from Venezuelan art in the 20th century. Certain preoccupations were shared among the Venezuelans' kinetic art, the desire to create geometric forms using bands, and the tendency to separate form and color. On this point, we cannot avoid mentioning Diffie. The French causes the retina to vibrate with using patches of proportional length. He confronts the entire set of problems surrounding the complicity of A in color perception, induction, equalization, temperature, and the interrelationships of colors, and uses them all to maximum advantage in his work. In his time, this was an act of considerable audacity, occurring when the Cubist project was still investigating the phenomenon of spatial instability, and the new role assigned to the spectator, but it had barely managed to consummate a disintegrated chiaroscuro. It was the kinetic artist who finally carried the investigation and incorporation of these dynamic elements to its ultimate consequences. Of course, they had antecedents, Seurat and the Pointillist, and if we disregard the anecdotal element in Diffie's work, we are left with a rhythmic succession of bands of colors, which is to say, a body of work that anticipates the colorisms of Otero and the first abstract paintings of Soto and Cruz Diez. ¿Cómo estoy de tiempo? Thus, the question of color raised by Soto and Cruz Diez is specific to this way of presenting color through lines. Moreover, through the effects of equalization and induction, they also formulate a new type of tonalism. They are atonal painters because they use serial color. They practice a hard-eight geometry based on the serial use of contrasting colors. In some of their work, however, Soto and Cruz Diez will soften a hard form via the use of equalization, Angleichung. What is this? It is a technique that moves between atonal and tonal systems, participating in both. Those who appreciate their paintings will perceive a metaphoric movement. Soto and Cruz Diez work with lines that intersect with other lines or with planes, thus creating a moire effect, which is the final step in the revolution initiated by the Impressionist painter Monet with his water lilies, Seurat and Signac, by demonstrating that the A acts like the painter's palette, blending colors. If A is in motion, the contribution of the kinetic artist are added to this, we will arrive to the culmination of the experiment. The dynamism of the moire, that for Soto is reality, a plexiglass plane drawn on in front of another, also drawn on behind with lines that, due to transparency, interfere with each other, as in double transparency, will be pictorialized by Cruz Diez, who in entering it defines a static moire that, although it requires no movement from the that perceives it, becomes dynamic through the use of color lines. Here, in fact, moire is not mechanically, but rather a visual fact, and this is what distinguishes him from other kinetic painters. In double transparency, Soto appears to be transcribing in an absolute way the spatial conception of a terrace painting, since he presents different parallel acrylic planes superimposed one in front of the other to the spectator. In this manner, he explores the problem of space perception. Soto thus continues an experiment already begun by Cubism, which demonstrated the relativity of perception, since when the spectator moves from the axis of a perpendicular view of the painting, the figures created by the superimposition of screens assume a different appearance. Soto confronts the spectator, implicating him or her in the work in order to achieve a more sensitive engagement. In fact, all the elements outside the painting are sensitive to the light, for example. His paintings are indeed a sort of anti-window, since instead of opening onto a space behind the surface, they come toward the spectator. In contrast to Boogie Woogie on Broadway, which although it's Mondrian's most dynamic painting, still remains ultimately static. This work by Soto does not employ a hard geometry, since it is perceptibly organic. The works comprising Hego's grids, reticularia series are articulated constructions consisting of cords or wires that are webbed or woven, terms that are connected with the language of textiles, and which takes Picasso's homage to Apollinaire, the first lineal sculpture, to its ultimate consequences. Sphere evokes the work of Naum Gabo and Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, but without his sense of a technological utopia. And it also recalls the heavenly constellation in a clear cosmic reference. The artist appears to be giving us a version of the earth with points of action. Organic constructivism it will conclude with this chapter. Europeans tend to justify geometric abstract art with intellectual and scientific arguments, about which Herbert Read would say it is not a question of joining art and science together in a sort of armistice, but rather of a singular process of visual communication, an integrated vision of the same phenomenon. Latin America, on the other hand, is suspicious of an art that entails a hard and pure scientism, along with its resulting modern technology, and it has assumed different posture. Here, European geometric abstract art has become transmuted into organic, here that means in Latin America, not in Texas, into organic constructivism, which is to say abstract art with a material, tangible, organic support. Constructivism originated in the periphery of Europe, in those regions that the Mexican philosopher Leopoldo Sea refers to as frontier populations. Not modern residues persisted, and rationality assumed other characteristics. It was carried to the very threshold of mysticism. Later, this constructivism was to achieve a continuity and a particular elaboration that would transform it into organic constructivism in another peripheral region, that of Latin America, and maybe Spain too. Torres-Garcia became the point of departure from and within which kinetic art was to gestate, just as with Baroque art. It is with kinetic art that Latin America has once again made his flow of influences with European reciprocal. The Baroque, both Spanish and Portuguese, has without a doubt had a powerful influence in native Latin American culture. But the vernacular forms it assumed here exerted an influence on Spain and Portugal, as well as much more so than Europe is able to admit. How much of Baroque repertoire comes from Latin America? The process was, in great measure, similar to what is happening with kinetic art today, to the point that it would be difficult indeed to clearly establish how much and in which direction the influence has flowed. What is most important, however, is that kinetic art, the art of motion, is an authentic medium of expression for societies that are also in motion, including tumultuous social disorder and the capacity to live entropically. It is perhaps less so for societies with a high technological capacity. In Latin America, industrial cities coexist with primitive cities. If some of these produce too much entropy and others little, art participates in a certain disorder, but it also accepts simplicity. Kinetic art is not reducible, Latin American kinetic art is not reducible to technology, although it requires it. Latin American kinetic art is not merely functional, but also existential, politically engaged, because it's an art of instability, and the moire is unstable, an art of ambiguity between figure and ground, up and down, etc., an art created when our continent was on the brink of the abyss. In 1978, I wrote vertical and horizontal, virtual, real, physical or spiritual, minimum elements of the constructive language. All the Latin American organic constructivists are builders who build with what has been destroyed. In this way, they achieve an organic construction inherited from Torres-Garcia and not from Mondrian, from America and not from Europe. Later, I wondered, a contradiction in terms? For a European, perhaps. For us, no. In Latin America, everything coexists with everything. That is why, although our artists, like the more orthodox European constructivists, made use of rectangles to plastically configure their material, their right angles and their vertical and horizontal lines are more a function of the eye than of geometry, and therefore the purity of their geometry is contaminated. Today, we can affirm that this tradition of organic constructivism is as an original word that Latin America has given to the world. Thank you and sorry for my Spanish pronunciation.
Okay, after these three presentations, I hope that you have a lot of questions. We would like to start a little debate about all the ideas that have been brought by the presenters. I don't know if some of you may want to start? Miriam?
So I've actually gone to see the Reina Sofia many times, and I'm really fascinated with the way in which the narratives have been completely opened up with all the use of print culture materials and cinema, photography, etc. One thing that I was curious about though is when we're in a museum, when we're curating and we open up narratives and we get away from the linear, the sort of closed narrative, how do we translate that for the diverse visitors? Like I was just wondering about your philosophy regarding the didactic materials that the visitors would have access to when they go there, and sort of who are you writing those for?
I didn't put any images of the building, but I mean, the visitor has a. We have something already gained, is the visitor gets lost at the first minute. Because there was a original scene, as you know, is that Carmen Jiménez always complains when they ask her, what is the worst thing that it happened in your period as director of fine arts and director of exhibitions in Reina Sofia? And she says, I mean, it's a joke, but she said it, is the two elevators that Tomás Llorens did in the entrance. And the truth is that when you go to Reina Sofia, you never know it to go right and left, like the government. I mean, no, they know they know they go right or extreme right, that's their doubt. So, but in any case, jokes aside, the truth is that the collection, when it will be finished, it will have like 5 areas, it will be 5 floors, it will be like 7,000 square meters, so it will be really huge. And it will have many levels, so you could have, it's like navigating in internet in a way. You could have, it's like going to an archive. So you could have, as a visitor, let's say one visit which the museum can favor, so the museum can especially promote. I mean, you could have, but then you could have many. The way I imagine when everything is finished is that you could have several levels of reading. As I say, you would have the layers or the labels promoted by the curators, by the people associated with academically with the museum. So then you have all this reading of the 40s and 60s. You might have, for example, in the collection, in the 3rd chapter of the collection, there is a big discussion about public sphere, I mean visually, about public sphere, about Ochetti di Meno, about how to do things in a period of entropia, about how not to do objects anymore, etc., etc. But you could have also another type of reading, which is reading of people coming from other areas, like dance, like architecture, like many other things. We are already promoting some of those through flyers, through different type of guides. And of course you can create your own reading. I mean, you can want to select different things. I mean, a complaint I have, not often, but once in a while, is that people that wants to see all the Picassos together or all the Dalis together, and suddenly they are in different places, and they consider that a scandal, and they say they get tired. But that's an option that somebody might want to go to the different places and finally see their own selection. So we'll be through these different levels. How to do that? Obviously with graphic material, with flyers, with small books, and of course through internet. We have a technical problem in the old building of Reina Sofia, which is the walls are like 1 meter big, so it's a problem for internet to work properly, although it's I heard that that's going to be changed quickly. But for the presentation of the Cisneros collection, we already work in a program that people can also, a guide in a way, an archive that people can take with their own iPad or iPhone.
Following that line, I was curious about the way that you installed, perhaps this is because it's a working process, but the way that you installed Guernica, where you have the display of the context and you address many different levels, not just the work, but what happened in Spain at that time, people's responses to Pavilion, all of that. But it seems like when you move to other areas like the post-war, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, you were just concentrating on the work of art. And particularly with regards to Latin America, I understand that the images that you showed were from the Cisneros collection, and that may still be in process. But I mean, will there be an attempt to also contextualize, those works, and what kinds of materials and strategies are you using for that?
Yeah, of course, there is so much work on process that the collection is the collection Cisneros, it's not Reina Sofia. So it's really process. And the idea, is to contextualize, to articulate the work with document. The document is obviously very important. In the 40s and 50s with Spain, you also have La Codorniz, for example, and the document is not just an information, it's a space. With films, with architecture, with through anachronisms, and with Latin American is exactly the same. I mean, it could be done, of course, through magazines, through many things. For example, in the area of the exile near Guernica, and that's Spain, but it's Latin America. One element, which is the element that somehow gives unity to everything, is not so much the work of art, although there is a kind of common, kind of post-surrealist style that is general, but it's literature. Is because the books were the elements that somehow circulated between Mexico, Argentina, and so literature there is at the center. So this also shift from, when you have documenting or you have other elements, is not the painting is hierarchically better or worse. It's just they keep changing. So with Latin America, the idea is to do the same, of course.
And who decides that process? I mean, is it a team of curators that and other people that decide what kind of strategies and materials you're going to use?
We work with many people and we fight with most of them too, but we still talk to all of them. And the idea is, we work with different people. For example, the popular part in the 40s and 50s is done with somebody, the photography, so we work with different people. But at the end, somebody has to take the decision. So in case of doubt.
Yeah, but it's an internal team.
No, also, no. It's internal, and we have, it's like a cosmology. We have a nucleus, but then it goes, it has some kind of flexibility. So you have people that is from outside, from different areas.
Flexibility into what it can encompass in terms of education, or in terms of sort of the idea that many education curators are in a way using art as social practice to, in a sense, to use the museum as a political space. So I wonder how in a university museum that is relevant or not.
Well, I think the whole idea of using it as a political space, I mean, in a fine arts museum, I think that we would be absolutely open to that. I mean, and the idea of building like relationship, that's something that I think that we are also thinking very heavily in how to do and how to design. In the case of the Meadows, being a collection that's small, a collection that's so focused in Spanish art, a collection that has extremely high quality, but also it goes all the way from medieval to contemporary. One of the things that we've been thinking and exploring about building this kind of constellation of institutions to be working with, is like defining what are the greatest collections, let's say, of Spanish art in the world. And trying to make like a consortium of those institutions and try to bring together like the top 20, top 25 institutions and try to think about how we can work together, how we can bring maybe once a year curators to discuss what's going on in their institutions. Maybe another year is folks from education. Maybe another year is board members and things of that sort, and really try to build, you know, a network that can be working on a constant basis. That's something we've been thinking a lot about, and we will look. That's as a consortium, and that was very interesting in seeing like all the different institutions that Borja Villel was pointing out in his slide, and it's interesting because maybe different institutions have different constellations. You know, I mean, we would love to have in our constellation the Reina Sofia, of course, but also like defining in some ways who you are. I mean, and how to go deeper. That's a lot of the things that we've been looking at. There's this. We're in Texas, no, and here we are into drilling business. So there's this expression that says, "Drill, baby, drill." So I think that what we have doing is like drill into and continue drilling in this kind of what makes us number one in the world, and that's you know, the collection in the Spanish, and through that open the hands to everything and anything, especially Latin America, of course, because it's part of the Spanish world. Did that answer your question?
Okay, one of our collaborators talking about cosmologies.
No, only I would like to say, I was working in the Reina Sofia before Manolo get the direction with Tomás Jalín and María Corral, no?
Maybe you can, yeah, turn around.
It's, for me, because I'm interested in narratology, it's very, very singular to talk about now. Guernica is conceptualized in the form of the project that Guernica was demanded for the Spanish Republican government. In the other position of Guernica in the Reina Sofia, Guernica was too contextualized. It was contextualized in a metaphysical position, not in a real historical position. It was contextualized in the Spanish symbol is the war. The Spanish symbol is a tragedy. Art in Spain is sometimes in tragedy's way, no? Now, in the Casón of Buen Retiro, the Guernica was contextualized in a genre, no? It's another metaphor of the Guernica. I don't know if you can explain that. I know you agree or no. Me preocupa que siempre se dice que el Guernica estaba contextualizado antes. Y yo creo que antes estaba contextualizado también en planeamientos metafísicos sobre España y sobre la guerra y sobre la tragedia.
In any case, we don't have any pretense to truth. Also, we don't believe in what French call n'importe quoi. It's not just some kind of eclectic. We believe in approximations in what we are doing, and we thought that today this type of meaning makes sense, which probably does, because I heard that some of the new government, they complained that the Reina Sofia was too memorialist. And I mean, you know, the transition in Spain, the democratic transition, is still going on, and the civil war is still not totally solved. And the truth is that some of the people in the government complain that the intellectuals are still too focused on the civil war. It probably implies something. But again, there are many contextualizations. In any case, the Guernica, just being very specific to your question, I think you asked that too, has only moved 3 times in Spain. Once from Casón del Buen Retiro, where it was isolated, it was a symbol, it was the context, it was the civil guard, and that was of course a context. And actually some sociologists, they say that the transition in Spain ended when the civil guards disappeared out of Guernica. It moved in 92 to Reina Sofia. It was in one room, and then it moved to another, cross the hall. And it has never moved. The film, it was added in this new contextualization. Actually, now is not there. Now we have Goya's prints in front of Guernica.
Somehow I have to explain my point of view of why this piece could be here, why could that be there. Meaning that there is an intellectual thought behind the way that everything is placed, and the museum is not just a didactic place as a place to think much farther. I'm trying to think of something. What is the aim of the museum as far as this particular? What are, because you're speaking at different levels, and I understand that. And then, for example, academia are going to read different things that are the regular person that wants things. What is your concept? What do you think the person that comes in is going to get from it?
The ultimate goal, it will be, I think work of art is about knowledge, but the work of art is also about affections. And affections and knowledge, they are much more, because it's about creating a space in common. It's about creating a space where an ignorant, we are all ignorant, an ignorant teaches to another ignorant. And by this kind of teaching, again, you create a community. This will be this community, which is a community, it's a democratic space, a space of negotiation, a space of questioning. That will be the objective.
Marie-Carmen has one last.
Yes, I have a question for Andrew.
Yes.
Which, if I understood well what he said, particularly at the end, you asserted that Latin American constructivism really comes or emerges out of Torres-Garcia and not Mondrian, which I think is a particular narrative that has been in place in Latin America as a way of differentiating what these movements were from Europe. It's one that I have also asserted and have been in agreement. But I think when you analyze a number of cases, some of the ones that you mentioned, I think it is a far more complex situation, because I think Torres was obviously a very important paradigm, particularly for Argentina, for Colombia, for certain groups of artists that gravitated around his ideological concerns. But when it comes to Brazil, or it comes to even Venezuela, I think Mondrian was very much of an important point of departure for these artists. So I don't think it is a matter so much of these artists following in Torres-Garcia's model or adhering to Torres-Garcia's model. but how they negotiated, you know, that relationship directly to Mondrian and sought, you know, their own responses, you know, to that. I think it's far more complex depending on what was happening in Brazil, what was happening. I wouldn't even say Venezuela, because I really question this whole notion of the Venezuelan kinetic art. I mean, the Venezuelan kinetic artists were working in Paris. You know, yeah. the narrative goes in another direction.
Torres-Garcia began in Paris too.
Yeah. I absolutely know.
Spent a lot of time in Spain too.
But the Torres that we're talking about is the Torres that is already in
Montevideo.
Yeah. And who's writing about an American art and who's grounded, you know, in that tradition. And I'm not questioning that, because I defend that. I'm one of the first ones to defend that view of Torres. But I'm just questioning, you know, how we write that narrative, you know, and how much more complex is the relationship and the role of Mondrian in all of these, you know, micro-narratives, you know, that we see in the different countries.
Of course, it's a complex issue. Nevertheless, in Brazil, the concrete artists were against Torres and for Mondrian, but the neo-concretists were for Torres and against Mondrian. This is
I'm not so sure, because the starting point for Elio Tisica is Mondrian.
But you have to read the letters between Elio Tisica and Lygia Clark, and Lygia Clark cut away Mondrian, much more than Picasso. Remember that.
They negotiate their own relationship to Mondrian, but it doesn't really, you know, pass through Torres-Garcia. I mean, they subvert Mondrian, they do invert him, they do, you know, all sorts of things with him. But it is a starting point.
Yes. On the other hand, in Venezuela, well, not only in Venezuela, people against abstract art, like Guayasamín, for instance, he told me that once the first trip he did to Europe, he had to pass from Quito to Montevideo. And he bought in a library the big book by Torres-Garcia, Universalismo Constructivo. And then he were absolutely astonished. And nevertheless, his figurativism is against Torres-Garcia work. He was a Torres-Garcia. Fernando de Chislo, Diana told me she met him some days ago. He wrote that for Latin America, Torres-Garcia was very important because instead of taking, well, let's say, the narrative ideas of pre-Columbian art, he took only the structure of...
Yeah, he appropriated, as you said.
Yes, that means not only the followers of Torres-Garcia were Torres-Garcia. You know me from long ago, I am not a chauvinist. I didn't include the Uruguayan Madis like Costigliolo and Maria Freire and so on. Well, I had the chance to make a big show of Soto in my museum. And he spent a couple of weeks in Montevideo. And you know, the dinosaurs, we have the chance to share, the privilege to share our ideas with colleagues from other generations. I spoke about my theory with Arden Quinn, in Havana with Sandu Darrié, and with Cruz Diez in La Coupole in Paris, of course, and more. All of them were agree absolutely of the importance of Torres-Garcia. It doesn't mean that they took his preachments literally. Nevertheless, their work, even they did it in Paris, was not a work absolutely Mondrianesque.
No. They subvert Mondrian, that's what I'm saying.
Well,
but it's still, it's the starting point, and not That's what I'm...
Well, we agree, like always.
I think that we are now run out of time, so thank you very much for all the questions, and thank you for the presentation.